result of the photography taking some concern. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and 2 new military encampments.
How far advanced is this?
Sir, we've never seen this kind of an installation before.
Only a few people knew of the existence of the surveillance photographs, much less the terrifying revelations they held. In October 1962, the Soviet Union was constructing nuclear launch sites in Cuba, within range of every major city on the eastern seaboard, including the U.S. capital.
It's hard to realize how frightened they were. They had conversations about evacuating great parts of the United States. They had estimates about how many tens of millions of people would die. They really thought that war was near.
Managing this crisis fell to a rookie president, John F. Kennedy. He was less than 2 years on the job, the youngest man ever elected to the office.
Nothing prepared him for this. The things that got him elected, the acute politician, the charming vote-getter, the money, the glamour, none of it had any bearing at all on his situation.
The qualities that had carried John Kennedy to the presidency, natural rebelliousness, stubborn self-reliance, spectacular self-confidence, had also led him to make mistakes and missteps that helped put the country in mortal danger. His predecessor in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, had called him Little Boy Blue and thought his wealthy father had bought him the office. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had taken Kennedy's measure at their first meeting a year earlier, and he walked away believing he could get the better of the untested president. If John F. Kennedy doubted himself or quailed at the enormity of the situation, he didn't show it.
He had a very great ability to step back, to be cool, to be detached, to not get sucked in by the passions of the moment, to not just ride the wave.
When he became angry, he tended to become very calm. There was a kind of burning anger in him that he didn't express very openly.
This man was fiercely independent, intellectually independent, fiercely. Kennedy had an unshakable sense of his own skills. He was confident about his ability to come up with the right answer. He wasn't bringing people together in a room to hammer out a consensus. He was bringing people in a room to give him the best information so that he could make the decision.
He had what he called the great man theory of governing. As a consequence, it put a lot of pressure on him.
Now, at a moment of peril and uncertainty, he would be forced to answer the question that had dogged him his entire career. Was he as tough, as smart, as capable as he appeared?
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. Miss Lincoln, is this taped in? Is this plugged in? Is this plugged in? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 19. I was the descendant of 3 generations on both sides of my family of men who had followed the political profession. In my early life, the conversation was nearly always about politics, period.
By the time he came of age, John Fitzgerald Kennedy inhabited a world of special exemption. The family estate in suburban New York, the summer compound in Hyannisport, the winter retreat in Palm Beach. The story of his family's heroic multi-generational rise from the want of Irish famine might well have been a misty old folktale. The past was not the point in the Kennedy household. Jack's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was one of the wealthiest men in America. An Irish Catholic businessman who had grabbed his fortune in the WASP-dominated world of high finance, and then became a celebrated administrator in President Franklin Roosevelt's momentous New Deal government. Joe Kennedy expected his sons in particular to have a large effect on the world.
He's a model of what they're taught to emulate. He's striving, he's reaching, he's always on the move, he's accomplishing, and it was expected of them to do the same thing.
They were very pampered and enabled. They were made to feel special, which is good, and they were special, and they were made to feel obliged to serve their country. That was great. But they were also given a kind of confidence that it would always go well for them.
After the stock market crash occurred in 1929, John Kennedy didn't know that there was all this privation in the country. He never wanted for a meal, and it wasn't until he read something later in high school and college about the Depression that it registered on his consciousness.
Even in the raucous Kennedy clan, even among his 8 brothers and sisters, Jack stood out. He kept his own schedule, usually late. He was apt to test the patience of his elders, unconcerned with rules and loose with money. He plied shopkeepers with the promise that his father would pay the bill, whatever it was.
Jack would expect maids to take care of him, cook his meals, do his laundry, pick up his clothes. And so he has a very privileged childhood, except for one thing, that he is burdened by a series of considerable health problems.
Jack almost died of scarlet fever in 1920, just before his 3rd birthday. 2 years later, a case of whooping cough landed him in another quarantine ward. Soon after, his parents shipped him off to a prestigious boarding school in Connecticut. Jack's letters home began to include reports of his shaky health. At Choate, Jack's ongoing digestive ailments made him a reliable customer of the campus infirmary.
Jack didn't know what was wrong with him. All he knew was that on a regular basis, he would take sick, get a high fever, end up in the hospital, that he couldn't gain weight, that he couldn't run around and play sports the way he wanted to.
He was terribly thin. He had recurrent bouts of nausea and vomiting, continual bouts of high fever, and he was tired all the time.
Joe Sr. worried that Jack might take on the image of someone who lacked the physical strength to achieve great things in life. By the time he was 17 years old, his health was so questionable, they sent him off to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, to try and figure out what his problems were.
Test results at Mayo indicated that Jack suffered from an intestinal inflammation called colitis. But the doctors warned him that he might have hepatitis, or worse, leukemia. When his blood count dropped to near-fatal readings, he made light. "They call me 2,000 to go Kennedy," he wrote a friend. "Took a peek at my chart yesterday and could see that they were mentally measuring me for a coffin."
He never stops joking and laughing, even in the worst circumstances. When the wife of his headmaster at Choate comes, she says, "Jack never stopped kidding around with me the whole time I was there."
He had to become very stoic, and at the same time, he had to project an image of vitality. So although he was feeling poorly a lot of the time, he couldn't let on that he was feeling poorly.
Joe Sr. refused to lower expectations for his second son, whatever his illness. "Don't let me lose confidence in you again," Joe wrote to Jack after a less than sterling report from the headmaster at Choate, "because it will be nearly an impossible task to restore it."
Joe Kennedy Sr. drives this point home to his sons. Joe Kennedy's message to them is, second is never good enough. Only first, only winning, only being at the top.
Joe Jr. was picked out, you're gonna be president, and Joe was determined to please Dad and was gonna do whatever Dad wanted. He was a familiar type, student body president, captain of teams, best-looking boy, destined for success. Jack was one step away. Yes, he wanted to please Dad, but he might think about it for a second. And there stirred in him a little quiet, and maybe even more than quiet, rebellion.
The problem with Jack, at least for his father, is he doesn't take anything seriously. Nothing. At Choate, where there is a strict prep school behavioral code, where the last thing you do is snicker or make fun of your teachers or talk behind their backs, Jack just can't help himself. You know, the more pompous the headmaster, the more ridiculous the speeches at chapel, the more he feels absolutely compelled not only to make fun himself, but to draw his circle of friends in. When he organizes a prank, all the other boys are in.
Jack Kennedy was a capable student in the courses he liked, indifferent to those he didn't. His acquaintance with the rules of spelling and grammar appeared fleeting. He spent much of his depleted energy on campus hijinks, or romance. Even in high school, his roster of conquests was a source of wonderment. "It can't be my good looks," he wrote to a Choate friend, "because I'm not much handsomer than anybody else. It must be my personality." When Jack announced his decision to join his prep school friends at Princeton, instead of following Joe Jr. to Harvard, his father made his disappointment known. "You want to get away from your brother, I take it. Too much competition." Fall term 1936, Jack enrolled at Harvard.
The Kennedys were a loving family, but bitterly competitive. This comes from the father, but it becomes entrenched with him. They're always putting each other down, verbally, games, sailing, touch football, nonstop competition. And a lot of it's joyous, but there's an edge there, too, almost a meanness.
Where Joe Jr. and Jack were concerned, friends remembered, everything was a contest. Whether a swim in the pool or a race to the breakfast table.
Jack was always smaller, punier. He never gave up, and he always got beat up. It was par for the course.
Jack would indulge in these sort of hit-and-run attacks, and it would frustrate Joe Jr., who would dash after him. But Jack was fast, and Joe wouldn't necessarily catch him. And so Jack learned how to compete in an effective way in a world where he wasn't always the biggest, the strongest, or the smartest.
At the end of Jack's sophomore year at Harvard, Joe Kennedy took a new job in London as ambassador to America's most important ally. Jack trailed his father across the Atlantic a few months later for a summer's work in his father's new office.
When Joe Kennedy Sr. became ambassador to Great Britain in 1938, it opened up a world for Jack which he had not quite glimpsed before. There was his father at the center of British social life, and it allowed Jack to make intellectual as well as social contacts with the most important people in Great Britain, and to engage in conversation and intellectual exchange, which stimulated him greatly. These were the roots of his interest in international affairs.
Jack had a front row seat that summer in the most consequential season of international gamesmanship in a generation. The German leader, Adolf Hitler, had spent the previous 5 years building the most powerful military Europe had ever seen. And in 1938, he was showing signs he might use it. Hitler had already frightened Austria into accepting annexation, and he was menacing Czechoslovakia and Poland. The rest of Europe, and America too, was trying to figure out how to handle the German threat. Joe Sr. knew what was at stake for his country and for himself. There was talk among serious Democrats that Joe Kennedy was in line for the presidency if Franklin Roosevelt decided not to run in 1940. The ambassador never stopped talking politics and policy, even when the workday was over, at the family's temporary residence, 14 Prince's Gate, Westminster, London.
Joe Sr. loved to encourage spirited debate among his children, particularly at mealtime. One of his friends said that she liked to watch what happened at the dinner table. It was sort of like Joe would drop a depth charge and wait for something to explode.
There was a lot of conversation about France and England and what was going to happen with England, what would happen with America, and when we entered the war.
Joseph B. Kennedy was convinced that if the United States was drawn into a war in Europe, that it would ruin the economy. Democracy would be lost. The millions of dollars he had put aside for his boys would be lost. The America he knew and loved would be lost. And it wasn't worth it. Europe was Europe. It was an ocean away. And he figured anything was better than going to war with Hitler. So why not try to make a deal with Hitler? Jack Kennedy listened to his father, and he sat and argued with his father at the dinner table about economics and world affairs.
Jack was back at Harvard in the fall of 1938. He monitored from afar the international summit in Munich, where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain struck a deal to cede a small piece of Czechoslovakia to Germany in exchange for a promise from Hitler that he would stop there. He also saw his father congratulating Chamberlain for keeping the peace.
Been asked by the newspaper men this afternoon what I thought the chances were of appeasement succeeding. I told them I wasn't sure at all, but it was certainly worthwhile trying.
Jack asked permission to spend the next semester back in Europe so he could gather material for a senior thesis. U.S. embassies and consulates would be obliged to welcome Joe Kennedy's boy. He was back at his parents' home in London by March 1939, right around the time Hitler broke his promise to Chamberlain and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Jack headed straight for the continent and beyond to see for himself what was happening.
He questions people, he talks, he listens, he reads the headlines. He hangs out in the consulates. He tries to talk to the diplomats in each of these countries and to the newsmen and the journalists.
Jack got as near the action as he could get. The border between Germany and Poland, where Hitler's powerful war machine appeared to be massing for attack. He was safely back at his father's embassy in London on September 1st, when German soldiers crossed into Poland and German planes began bombing cities, killing innocent civilians. Britain was bound by treaty to defend its ally Poland, and Jack was at the House of Commons to hear the war talk. He was on the streets watching as England prepared for war, and he listened in on Prime Minister Chamberlain's address to a nervous nation.
You can imagine What a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done.
Chamberlain's weakness, his dispirited call to arms, was something Jack Kennedy would never forget. The onset of war did offer Jack his first shot at public service and at public attention. When a German U-boat sank a British passenger liner with more than 300 Americans on board, Ambassador Kennedy sent 22-year-old Jack to reassure the survivors that the embassy would get them safely home. Mr. Kennedy, wrote a British newspaperman, displayed a wisdom and sympathy of a man twice his years. He arrived for his final year at Harvard with a self-confidence that surprised his professors and a new sense of purpose. He spent his last semester grinding away at his honors thesis, Appeasement at Munich. Jack's thesis cut against prevailing public sentiment, which held that British Prime Minister Chamberlain's actions at Munich had been dishonorable, even cowardly. Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler, he argued, had been understandable. Britain had been so lax in building its military in the previous decade that the Prime Minister had little choice but to go to the negotiating table and buy time. The 150-page paper got mixed reviews. His professors found it wordy and repetitious. But they had to admit it was an intelligent discussion of complacency in pre-war Britain. Joe Sr. was impressed enough to help get the thesis published. By the time John Kennedy graduated Harvard in June of 1940, his first book, Why England Slept, was on its way to the reading public. He hustled hard promoting his book and his big idea. Democracies had to be armed and ready to fight at all times, he said, the United States included.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At this time, we're indeed pleased to have with us in our studios Mr. John F. Kennedy. This young man has a clear-headed, realistic, unhysterical message for his countrymen and for his elders.
We must realize that we must always keep our armaments equal to our commitments. We cannot tell anyone to keep out of our hemisphere unless our armaments and the people behind these armaments are prepared to back up the command, even to the ultimate point of going to war. There must be no
The book was timely. Americans were beginning to wonder if Hitler's military could reach the United States. Why England Slept became a surprise bestseller. His father was near preening about Jack's literary success, a first in the Kennedy clan. When the Duchess of Kent told the ambassador she thought the boy was awfully young to be writing a serious book, Joe said simply, "My experience is that my sons are very precocious." They were headed in different directions, Jack and his father, on account of this war in Europe. The German army had already occupied Paris and appeared to be headed toward London. And Joe Kennedy was still advising President Roosevelt to keep the U.S. out of the fight. This was England's war, he said, and one they were likely to lose. Roosevelt was actively distancing himself from his wayward ambassador. By the time Joe Sr. was recalled from London, reporters on both sides of the Atlantic were calling him a Hitler apologist, a defeatist.
Yes, nothing to say until I've seen the president.
Joe Kennedy returned in disgrace and in the minority, And at some point, he decided he was going to make a speech defending his position. Joe had dozens of people he could have called on. Journalists, newspapermen, historians, researchers. He had professional speechwriters working for him. But he asked Jack to do it. Jack Kennedy wasn't a puppet. He didn't swallow his father's beliefs. And he said to him, you can talk about the need for compromise and for negotiations, but say over and over and over again that you hate Nazism, you hate fascism, you hate Hitler, and don't use the word isolationist or appeaser. Joe eventually gave that speech, and he followed some, but not enough of his son's recommendations, and ended up further on the outs with the Roosevelt administration.
Of course there's a risk in any course of action, but all doubts as to what is the best thing we can do should be resolved in the one statement, how can we best keep out of war?
Jack initially defended his father's isolationism, but as time went on, he realized that the United States needed to help Britain to get in the game, to fight for freedom. I mean, his father was dead set against American intervention. Jack becomes for it.
Air Cadet Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. reports for preliminary training. With other college men, he'll try for Navy wing.
The older Kennedy boys were doing more than talking war in 1941. Joe Jr. signed on as a flyer for the Navy, even though the U.S. had not yet entered the fight. Jack was no less keen to get his shot at glory, if war came. But he was unable to get past the military doctors. His poor health was impossible to miss.
When he was 20 years old, he began using steroids. It reined in his colitis, but it had terrible side effects. And it also began to cause deterioration of the bones in his lower back. So he was rejected as someone who would be what was called 4F.
He spends 5 months doing calisthenics, lifting weights, trying to build himself up enough that he still fails the examination. He tells his father that he has to arrange for him to have a special medical exam, which basically means a fixed medical exam, to clear him so he can get into the Navy.
The new ensign was assigned to Naval Intelligence in Washington, where he became an instant, if minor, celebrity. The ambassador's son found himself at cocktail hours and dinner parties with senators, admirals, foreign diplomats, newspaper publishers. They all wanted to know what the boy author thought about the big question of the day. Should the U.S. get into the war?
Sudden criminal attacks perpetrated by the Japanese in the Pacific provide the climax of a decade of international immorality. Powerful and resourceful gangsters have banded together to make war upon the whole human race. Their challenge has now been flung at the United States of America.
After Pearl Harbor, America needed warriors like never before. But Kennedy remained at safe remove in naval intelligence. When he finally, with the help of family connections, landed an assignment to train with a new combat unit, PT boats, he pronounced himself delighted.
Now, you know, PT boats were known as the bucking broncos of the Navy because they're very light-hulled and they skim so fast over the waves so that each wave is a bounce, each wave is a jolt. The men who served with it said he was always in pain.
This was rough service, and it was terrible on his back. Nevertheless, he perseveres and gets assigned to the Southwest Pacific, which is where the action is. fighting the Japanese.
Kennedy arrived in the Solomon Islands in the spring of 1943 and took command of a 56-ton attack boat, PT-109. He liked his 12-man crew, but was unimpressed by the higher-ups.
He was a very junior officer out in the Pacific. He was on the margins of the war, but he saw how a military operated not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And one of his favorite expressions was, the military screws up everything.
PT-109 skipper did little to distinguish himself in his first 4 months on duty. He and his men ran raids on Japanese supply convoys. They were shot at, and they fired back, but steered clear of major incident. Until a hot, starless night that August. Out on a routine mission, Kennedy had his vessel idling in open water when a Japanese destroyer emerged out of the darkness, racing at 40 knots, and split his boat in half. Two of his crewmen were killed immediately. It took Kennedy nearly 3 hours, swimming around in the dark, to gather the survivors onto what was left of his PT boat. His engineer, Pappy McMahon, was badly burned, in excruciating pain, and helpless. They were still stranded in open water at daybreak. Mid-afternoon, what was left of PT-109 was beginning to sink, and it looked like they had been left for dead.
They're drifting, holding on to the hull and drifting in the water when he sees a group of islands about 3 miles off. He tells them they have to swim to it to survive. But how is McMahon going to swim? McMahon is wearing a life jacket. Kennedy takes one of the straps, cuts it, puts one end in his teeth, tells McMahon to lay on his back, and then he tows him the 3 miles to this island. And when he gets up on the beach, he collapses. The men who were with Kennedy that day, they all speak of his sense of responsibility, that it was his job, that he would spare no effort to try and get help for his crew.
It took a week, but Kennedy did manage to get his crew rescued. Fortunately, he wrote to his father, they misjudged the durability of a Kennedy. He made it out alive a few months later, sent stateside for medical reasons. And when he arrived at his parents' winter home in Palm Beach, his weight was down to around 120. His back was so bad, he needed a brace and a cane to walk. But he was also a war hero. The Navy had made a public display of putting 2 medals on his bony chest. And the story of PT-109 made great copy, read by millions.
The country needs heroes at this point in the war. And so Jack, in a sense, fulfills that role. Here is this wealthy son of the famous ambassador to Britain who didn't have to go into this kind of combat service. And they don't talk about the fact that maybe his seamanship was in some ways deficient in that his boat was cut in half. His brother, who was in London as an aviator, wrote some letters to him that were kind of demonstrating in a subtle way how envious he was.
Joe Jr., of course, was not going to be outdone by his kid brother. He volunteered for a dangerous bombing run across the English Channel, in spite of the fact that he had already flown enough missions to earn a pass home. Just minutes into that secret mission, Joe's bomber exploded over the English countryside. His body was never recovered. Joe's worldly success was so assured and inevitable, Jack wrote, that his death seems to have cut into the natural order of things. The depth of his father's despair was unsettling. There is something about the firstborn that sets him a little apart, Joe Sr. wrote. You know what great things I saw in the future for him. And now, it's all over.
The thought never comes to Joe Sr. or anybody else in the family that now that Joe Jr. has been killed, Jack's got to step in and become the leader of the family and run for political office and become the standard bearer for the Kennedy family, because no one thinks Jack is well enough in 1944. He's skeletal. You can't imagine that this young man isn't dreadfully, dreadfully sick. And the pain from his back is such that he cannot stand up, sit down, lie down. It's unimaginable that he will be able to campaign for office or hold office.
Like many decisions in life, a combination of factors pressed on me, which directed me into my present profession, period. I was at loose ends at the end of the war, comma. I was not very interested in following a business career.
John Kennedy hinted in later years that he had entered politics to please his father. But friends who knew him best suspected the engine that drove Jack was his own. When the congressional seat once held by his grandfather and namesake, John Francis Fitzgerald, came open at the end of 1945, Jack jumped in feet first. He didn't mind if it antagonized every Democrat in the district who had dutifully waited his turn, which it did. You're not going to win this fight, one ward boss told Kennedy to his face. You don't belong here.
He's seen as a kind of carpetbagger, an interloper. He didn't live in Boston. And his opponents in the primary attack him for being a rich boy.
Even his best supporters wondered if Jack had it in him to challenge the local Democratic machine or to win in a field of better-known candidates. His health was still lousy. Yellow as saffron, thin as a rake, one friend said. He didn't seem built for politics, admitted another.
His father, of course, brings into the picture some of the very experienced Boston pals, and they see him as a work in progress. How is this really skinny guy who doesn't seem all that eager to clap hands and press the flesh, as they say, how are we going to convert him into a winning candidate?
They sigh when they see this kid. You know, he looks like a high school student. The major impediment to Jack is that he's not a very good candidate in the beginning. He's shy, he's withdrawn. He doesn't like going up to strangers or shaking hands. He talks much too fast when he gives speeches. Can't look at his audience. His voice is too high-pitched.
He used to often read from a prepared text, and he would do it in a mechanical way. They were so afraid that he would forget his speech that his sister Eunice once sat in the front row mouthing the words like an opera prompter.
Long odds or no, Joe Kennedy poured money into his boy's race in 1946. He paid for thousands of hand-painted yard signs, advertising in print and radio, a professional polling operation. He distributed 100,000 copies of the New Yorker article about Jack's war heroics. With the money I spent, I could have elected my chauffeur, he liked to joke. But his pride in his oldest remaining son grew as the campaign unfolded.
His father is watching him one day, standing at the gates of a factory, and this mob of factory workers come out, Jack is standing there shaking hands, asking for votes, and the father is standing across the street with a friend. He says, I never in a million years thought Jack could do that.
He taught himself, with the help of lots of money from his father, and voice coaches and political coaches, he taught himself how to be a candidate. He taught himself how to look at the people he was talking to, how to speak slowly. He spent twice as much time talking to the local parish and the boys' clubs and the veterans' clubs and the women's clubs. Whoever invited him, he went. He never, ever, ever stopped.
This is a man who's wearing this canvas-covered steel brace all the time. And on long days of campaigning, that's not enough to try and hold himself up. So he has an ace bandage, and he wraps it in a figure 8 around his thighs and his back to give him extra support. And this is the neighborhood of 3-deckers. So if you want to knock on doors, which was politics was then, you had to climb over and over again, one building and then the next. And he couldn't climb stairs in a normal way. What Jack Kennedy had to do was do it one step at a time. He'd put his foot on the next step and then pull his other leg up. And these old pals would see him climbing these steps over and over and never complaining. And they'd say, how are you feeling? You're not feeling too good? He said, I'm feeling fine.
He campaigned from sunrise to midnight, house to house, pub to pub, factory gate to factory gate, until he crumpled in a heap at the Bunker Hill Parade on the eve of the primary. Some of the staff thought he was having a heart attack. Joe Kennedy told them to give him his medicine and get him ready to campaign the next day, Election Day. He'd be fine. Jack won going away, nearly doubling the second-place finisher's vote total in the primary, and now a lock to win the general election in the heavily Democratic district in the fall. The kid was a winner after all.
They had conversations about evacuating great parts of the United States. They had estimates about how many tens of millions of people would die. They really thought that war was near.
Managing this crisis fell to a rookie president, John F. Kennedy. He was less than 2 years on the job, the youngest man ever elected to the office.
Nothing prepared him for this. The things that got him elected, the acute politician, the charming vote-getter, the money, the glamour, none of it had any bearing at all on his situation.
The qualities that had carried John Kennedy to the presidency, natural rebelliousness, stubborn self-reliance, spectacular self-confidence, had also led him to make mistakes and missteps that helped put the country in mortal danger. His predecessor in the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, had called him Little Boy Blue and thought his wealthy father had bought him the office. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, had taken Kennedy's measure at their first meeting a year earlier, and he walked away believing he could get the better of the untested president. If John F. Kennedy doubted himself or quailed at the enormity of the situation, he didn't show it.
He had a very great ability to step back, to be cool, to be detached, to not get sucked in by the passions of the moment, to not just ride the wave.
When he became angry, he tended to become very calm. There was a kind of burning anger in him that he didn't expect.
In my early life, the conversation was nearly always about politics, period.
By the time he came of age, John Fitzgerald Kennedy inhabited a world of special exemption. The family estate in suburban New York, the summer compound in Hyannisport, the winter retreat in Palm Beach. The story of his family's heroic multi-generational rise from the want of Irish famine might well have been a misty old folktale. The past was not the point in the Kennedy household. Jack's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was one of the wealthiest men in America. An Irish Catholic businessman who had grabbed his fortune in the WASP-dominated world of high finance, and then became a celebrated administrator in President Franklin Roosevelt's momentous New Deal government. Joe Kennedy expected his sons in particular to have a large effect on the world.
He's a model of what they're taught to emulate. He's striving, he's reaching, he's always on the move, he's accomplishing, and it was expected of them to do the same thing.
They were very pampered and enabled. They were made to feel special, which is good, and they were special, and they were made to feel obliged to serve their country. That was great. But they were also given a kind of confidence that it would always go well for them.
After the stock market crash occurred in 1929, John Kennedy didn't know that there was all this privation in the country. He never wanted for a meal, and it wasn't until he read something later in high school and college about the Depression that it registered on his consciousness.
Even in the raucous Kennedy clan, even among his 8 brothers and sisters, Jack stood out. He kept his own schedule, usually late. He was apt to test the patience of his elders, unconcerned with rules and loose with money. He plied shopkeepers with the promise that his father would pay the bill, whatever it was.
Jack would expect maids to take care of him, cook his meals, do his laundry, pick up his clothes. And so he has a very privileged childhood, except for one thing, that he is burdened by a series of considerable health problems.
Jack almost died of scarlet fever in 1920, just before his 3rd birthday. 2 years later, a case of whooping cough landed him in another quarantine ward. Soon after, his parents shipped him off to a prestigious boarding school in Connecticut. Jack's letters home began to include
result of the photography taking someone's hair. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and 2 new military encampments.
How far advanced is this?
Sir, we've never seen this kind of an installation before.
Only a few people knew of the existence of the surveillance photographs, much less the terrifying revelations they held. In October 1962, the Soviet Union was constructing nuclear launch sites in Cuba, within range of every major city on the eastern seaboard, including the U.S. capital.
It's hard to realize how frightened they were. They
expressed very openly.
This man was fiercely independent, intellectually independent, fiercely. Kennedy had an unshakable sense of his own skills. He was confident about his ability to come up with the right answer, He wasn't bringing people together in a room to hammer out a consensus. He was bringing people in a room to give him the best information so that he could make the decision.
He had what he called the great man theory of governing. As a consequence, it put a lot of pressure on him.
Now, at a moment of peril and uncertainty, he would be forced to answer the question that had dogged him his entire career. Was he as tough, as smart, as capable as he appeared?
Good evening, my fellow citizens. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. Miss Lincoln, is this taped in? Is this plugged in? Is this plugged in? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 19.
I was the descendant of 3 generations on both sides of my family of men who had followed the political profession.